Stones are perhaps some of humanity's oldest friends. They provided building materials and became simple tools, but they also vary in size, making some of them very portable as amulets. So it's no wonder that they've accrued both law and superstition alike. For example, the heaviness and general permanence of stone slabs led to their use as boundary markers. In Brittany, it was a crime to move a boundary stone, and if caught, you were expected to carry the stone on your head until you met someone who would tell you to put it back in its rightful place. So from hag stones to healing fossils, let's go and dig into the folklore of stones in this week's episode of Fabulous Folklore. Hello there and welcome to Fabulous Folklore, the podcast for all things folklore, occult and just a bit weird. I'm your host Icy Sedgwick, blogger, fantasy author and your guide into these rather mysterious realms. I've got some rare things to show you, so come on in, take a look around, but be careful not to touch anything. These things sometimes bite. Well, hello there and welcome back to Fabulous Folklore with me, your host, Icy Sedgwick. We are continuing our theme this month of the folklore of different types of material, and we're going to be having a look in this episode at stones. Now, I do want to start off by saying that we're not going to be looking at precious or semi-precious stones for one simple reason. Folklore is often about the beliefs and customs of ordinary people, and what we would now consider crystals, so that's things like amethyst, rose quartz, citrine, whatever, would largely be beyond most people's reach, both to find them and afford them. So instead we're going to be having a look at the superstitions and beliefs that were attached to regular stones that you might stumble across. And we're not going to be covering stone circles because that's a completely different topic altogether. So if you are interested in those, then I do have an exclusive episode of the podcast for Patreon supporters, which covered stone circles, stand-in stones, burial mounds, caves and all that kind of thing. And you can get access to that by becoming a Fabulous Folklore supporter on Patreon at the £3.50 a month or higher tier. But let's dig into this week's episode. Now we're going to start off with superstitions, and in Fladder in Scotland there was a church dedicated to St Columba, and a round blue stone once sat on the altar. If a fisherman couldn't leave the island because of the wind, he would wet the stone, which would apparently bring favouring winds, and according to the legend, this particular tradition always worked. There were, of course, other ways that you could change your fortune by wetting a stone, and I do realise that sounds a bit weird. But the Folklore Journal in 1914 reported a superstition that had been recorded in North Wales in the 1890s, where a schoolboy used a stone to bring himself luck. And he would find a white stone in the road, and then he would spit on it before throwing it over his head while saying, lucky stone, bring me luck when I go home." Now, this isn't actually as odd an idea as it might initially sound, because in Brighton, one tradition saw people spitting on holed stones found on the beach. Having spat on the stone, or sometimes through the hole, they threw them over their left shoulder or into the sea for luck. And the thrower would pray for better luck before they spat on the stone. Now, stones with holes in them actually had a whole range of names, including hag stones and witch stones. And in the north of England, people called these adder stones, which is a little bit confusing because adder stones also referred to snake stones, which we are going to get to soon. But either way, these holed stones were believed to ward off witchcraft and any diseases sent by witches. Now, in the late 19th century, people hung holed flints from bedsteads to cure attacks of ague, which some people think was actually a form of malarial fever. And elsewhere, people wore holed flints to guard against backache. I should point out that these are stones where the hole is naturally occurring, so it's maybe being worn or weathered away. It's not one that you've put in yourself. Now, people found many uses for their holed stones. Some people would hang them over their table to ensure that they always had plenty to eat. Some people hung them behind their front door to protect the home from lightning strikes. And one person even hung one over a staircase to stop anyone from falling down the stairs. And in an interesting twist, many people preferred hanging their stones using copper wire, and obviously we did cover the folklore of copper last week. If you added one of these holed stones to a bunch of keys, this would apparently bring prosperity to everyone in the house that those keys belonged to. And perhaps one of the most common uses of these holed stones was hanging them above your bed to prevent you from being hag-ridden. Now, nowadays we recognise the symptoms of being hag-ridden as sleep paralysis, but in earlier times people thought there were nocturnal attacks being caused by witches, and I mean they are quite terrifying if you ever go through an episode like that, so you can see why people would ascribe sort of a supernatural element to it. So hanging one of these stones over your bed would prevent a hag from being able to do anything to you. People also believed that supernatural creatures, including witches, might actually steal their horses during the night and then ride them to the point of exhaustion. And this, quite confusingly, was also called hag riding. And again, simply hanging a hold stone above the animal in the barn could ward off harm. Now, I mentioned snake stones before, and essentially they are a name given to fossils which were found as unusually shaped stones, obviously before people really necessarily understood fossils that well. And a plethora of fossils were actually given quaint names which suited their status as charms. So ammonites were snake stones, grapheas were devil's toenails, belemnites were thunderbolts or St. Peter's fingers, and fossil encrinites were St. Cuthbert's beads. And people in Scotland would use devil's toenails to help ease joint pain, and people in Gloucestershire ground up belemnites and then blew the dust into a horse's eyes if they watered too much. Now, people in Whitstable actually carried what they called cramp stones as amulets to ward off cramp, and these were actually fossilised shark's teeth rather than actual stones. Now, Henry III claimed that he had a snake's tongue set into gold, and because of the fact it was supposedly from a snake, it therefore warded off poison. But because of the forked nature of the stone, it's more likely that it was actually a shark's tooth. But snake stones are the one that I want to come back to, because ammonites are absolutely brilliant anyway, and you could actually ward off a lightning strike in your home by keeping an ammonite on your windowsill. But they were often referred to as snake stones because they do resemble curled up snakes, and other people thought that they were actually carried in a serpent's mouth. Now, one Welsh belief claimed that snakes found near hazel trees that hosted mistletoe would have precious stones in their heads. And some writers did note that no stones had actually been found in any snakes, although there is a caveat in the law. You did have to remove the stone from the head while the snake was still alive, because if the snake died first, then the stone dissolved. How convenient. But in Whitby, people believed that ammonites were actual snakes that had been turned into stone by St. Hilda. Now, obviously, the problem with this one is that if they're petrified snakes, they don't actually have any heads, but various legends did try to explain that St. Cuthbert somehow caused the snakes to be beheaded before St. Hilda petrified them. And some people did actually then later claim to have found the heads of the snakes, although again, this is unlikely, because we obviously do know that they are actually ammonites. And Keynsham in Somersetshire actually has a similar legend, where St. Keyna apparently turned venomous snakes into stone through prayer. And finally, some people actually call ammonites the horns of Ammon, because their coiled shape resembled the horn of a ram, and the Egyptian god Ammon, also known as Ammon, had a ram's head. Now, various birds were associated with stones that seemingly had magical or medicinal powers, and you either found the stones in their nest or inside the bird itself. Now, there are a lot of birds with their own stones, but eagles and swallows are perhaps two of the best known. Eagle stones only appeared in eagles' nests, if you believed our old friend Pliny the Elder, and I don't know why anyone would. But eagle stones were prescribed to pregnant people who wanted to protect themselves and their baby. Now, an eagle stone was a small brown hollow rock, and it usually contained pebbles or sand, so if you shook it, it would rattle. And the rattling meant that people thought that the eagle stone seemed to be pregnant, and that's why they became amulets for pregnant women. The advice directed women to wear them around the neck or around their left arm, and this would then protect the baby and make sure it wasn't born too soon. But if you do want to learn more about the folklore of eagles specifically, again, I've got an exclusive episode on them for Patreon supporters. Now, swallows also had their own stones, which were known somewhat unsurprisingly as swallow stones, and according to Pliny the Elder again, tying one to the left arm of an epileptic patient would relieve the condition. Lots of emphasis here on the left arm as well. And other people swore by swallow stones for their powers to cure eye diseases. Now, earlier writers thought that swallows actually simply swallowed small stones to help with digestion, and these then end up in the gizzard where they can help grind up food, and it seems to be these stones that people prized so highly. Collecting them was a somewhat arduous task, since you needed to collect them from baby swallows while the parents were absent. You also couldn't let the stones touch the earth or they would lose their powers. Now, the folklore of these stones persisted for the longest in France, continuing into the 19th century. Now, this is us discussing the use of fossils as stones, but there were also other things that people might find lying around, such as flint. And flint made a really good choice for stone axe heads or arrowheads. But then when people came across them many centuries later, people assumed they were fairy weapons. Elf bolts or elf shot are common names for them. And people essentially believed that these elves lived in a shadowy otherworld alongside our own, and that they could cause illness by firing these elf shots at people. You can read more about this belief in my article on elf shot and Old English medicine, which I have linked in the show notes below. But despite this link with elves causing illness with them, people actually believed that the flints had some connection with healing. So they would pop them in water while they were boiling it, and then they would use the water both for eye complaints and childbirth pains. And in Cornwall, people used this particular water to treat rheumatism. People would also set the flints into frames and then wear them as amulets, and one man in Scotland apparently still had one in the 1880s to guard against witchcraft. Although ironically, Scottish witches were apparently believed to use these stone arrowheads to cut clay or wax images as part of their witchcraft. But we can't really talk about stones in folklore and not mention their links with the supernatural. And plenty of contemporary accounts of paranormal activity seem to include stones being thrown at anyone involved, and the activity is usually assigned to poltergeist. That said, if you've seen The Haunting from 1963, and if you haven't, you really should, you'll know that Dr. Markway chooses Nell to be in his experiment after it rained rocks on her house when she was younger. And the assumption is that Nell actually caused this stony shower herself through a form of telekinesis. Now, there is a possibility that the idea of supernatural stone throwing actually comes from accounts of witches and demons who were throwing stones in early demonological literature, although that isn't actually a common part of these accounts. And instead, people believe that witches might throw stones as part of their spell casting, while demons threw them to scare people. That said, one 1698 pamphlet actually recounted an instance of lithobolia or stone throwing, and stones apparently fell both inside the afflicted home as well as outside. And even Sir Walter Scott recounted a tale of poltergeist activity that seemingly saw a sailor pelted with stones on a road. That said, he only admitted this after confessing to the murder of the youth whose ghost apparently threw the stones. So it does make me wonder how much of that was a story invented by the sailor in order to give him an opportunity to confess to something he was probably feeling quite guilty about. Now, while Scott was dubious about the phenomenon, stone throwing has become a common staple in ghost hunting TV shows. And I don't necessarily want to pour cold water on the whole thing, but it's obviously going to be quite easy for someone off camera to throw something like a stone, which is going to make a sound, but not really create a huge amount of fuss visually. It's easy enough for someone to throw that from off the camera. Just saying. And unfortunately, a persistent belief in paranormal circles is the so-called stone tape theory. And I believe in ghosts as much as the next person. I think anyone who knows me will know that I've had weird experiences and things like this. But anytime I listen to a show or something like that and someone who is supposedly a paranormal expert suddenly trots out stone tape theory, that's the point that they essentially lose me. Because if you've not come across it before in its most basic form, the theory, and I say that in inverted commas, claims that the energy around traumatic events becomes imprinted on the surrounding stones, and that then replays at certain times, which turns hauntings into repeat performances. And there's a lot to like about the idea, because you think, well, that would explain why different people seem to encounter a replay of a tragic event later on. And essentially, it actually derives from various 19th century writers who liked the idea that human activity could imprint on the environment. And members of the Society for Psychical Research, such as Eleanor Sidgwick, proposed theories that certain materials were better recording media than others. But one problem with the stone tape theory is that it doesn't actually explain why some people can interact with spectral entities in some hauntings, because if it was only a replay, that would be like thinking that you could change the course of events in a TV show that was filmed 4 years ago. And it also doesn't explain hauntings where ghosts seem to just simply wander about different locations, or indeed are seen in several locations at the same time. Now, contemporary writers have also noted that it's almost impossible to test, meaning you can't actually call it a theory, because a theory is something that someone comes up with that you then check to see if it's genuine, and because it hasn't been tested and essentially can't be tested, it doesn't make it a theory, it's just more of an idea. And indeed, writers have also noted that no one has identified how anyone would actually play back such information, even if it could be imprinted onto the stone. But I do want you to remember that its name largely derives from the stone tape, which is an excellent, if slightly hammy, 1972 film. So I think we do have to take this particular theory with a hefty dose of salt. I do highly recommend Sharon A. Hill's blog post, which details why the theory doesn't work from a geological perspective, which I have linked in the show notes if you are actually interested in this kind of thing. And I do think, as I say, I do believe in ghosts and the supernatural, but I just think some of the attempts to make it scientific sort of fall at the first hurdle a little bit. So what do we ultimately make of the folklore of stones? Well, you do see a bit of a common thread through these examples. Stones are incredibly hard wearing, they are actually quite plentiful, and they're very portable. They're easy to use as amulets to ward off illness and disease, yet fossils in particular also play their part in folk medicine. And these fragments of the prehistoric world then become imbued with healing properties. But I think in some ways this is almost what makes it difficult to take supernatural stone throwing seriously, because why would witches be able to throw stones if stones were able to ward off witchcraft? I leave that one to you to ponder. But I would like to know what you think about all this. Do you collect stones? I actually have a nice little collection of just cool stones that I found on beaches, usually because I like the patterns on them. And I do actually have a hold stone that an ex found for me on the beach, which I was chuffed about because I'd always wanted to find one like in the wild and I never had, and he found one, and I do actually have that in my living room. So if you do actually have any of these hag stones or hold stones or whatever you want to call them, again, please do let me know because they are quite cool. But yeah, so we're going to have a look at another material next week. I haven't decided yet if it's going to be glass, paper or wood. It's basically going to depend how the research goes. So there we go. But yeah, so I hope you enjoyed the folklore of stones. And obviously don't forget we did do the folklore of metal last week. So there's a little bit of crossover through that little link with the copper there. But I'll see you next week when we come back to have a look at another type of material. Cheerio. Well, thanks for listening and I hope you enjoyed that episode. If you did, feel free to leave a review wherever you listen to podcasts because that helps other people find the show too. It also takes between 4 and 6 hours to research, write, record and edit these episodes, so if you want to help support my time in doing that, then you can buy me a coffee. Or you can join the Fabulous Folklore family on Patreon and enjoy extra benefits including exclusive episodes and articles and even illustrated talks. All the links you need are below and thanks in advance.